The sound came just before dawn. Wild, ragged hooves tearing up the frost-hardened earth, louder than any thunder Clara had heard since the night she buried her shame and sealed the past behind her cabin door. She pulled on her coat with shaking hands and stepped onto the porch as the first light stretched across the hills, her shotgun half raised. But what emerged from the trees wasn't a rider. It was a half-dead roan horse, staggering, soaked in sweat and blood, and barely holding to its final strides before collapsing at her feet with a hollow, shuddering groan. Clara rushed forward, the gun forgotten, kneeling beside the trembling animal, her breath catching at the sight of a shattered arrow buried in its flank. Blood soaked the saddle and ran in rivulets down its side. But what made her fall back onto her heels in stunned silence wasn't the wound. It was the name burned into the saddle leather in a child's shaky hand. Willa. Her throat went dry. That name didn't belong to just anyone. It was the name she had whispered once, in secret, to a newborn girl before handing her to the nun who promised to raise her far away from the judgment of townsfolk and the scorn of her own kin. No one was supposed to know. No one could have known. Willa wasn't even 2 weeks old when Clara gave her up, not out of cruelty, but from a cowardice she'd carried like a second spine ever since. For 11 years, she had told herself it was mercy, that the child would have a better life in a home with a roof that didn't leak and a name untainted by sin. But now the past had ridden back to her doorstep, bleeding and breathless and branded into leather. The horse let out a soft, rattling snort and fell still. Clara reached forward with trembling fingers, unbuckling the saddle straps and pulling it free to examine it closer. Underneath the flap was a folded piece of paper, soaked and crumpled but still legible. She peeled it open, the words scratched in hurried ink. "She's alive. They're hunting her. Please, hide her." Clara's heart nearly stopped. She scanned the woods, saw no one, but felt suddenly watched. The girl, her girl, was out there, and someone wanted her silenced, not tomorrow, not someday. Now Clara stood, saddle in hand, resolve curling tight in her chest like a match about to strike. She had once given up her daughter to protect her. She would not make the same mistake twice. Clara barely slept that night, the saddle resting on her kitchen table like a ghost that refused to fade. The name Willa seared deeper into her bones than it had been into leather. She checked her rifle twice, then 3 times, and as the sky turned pale over the distant ridge, she moved through her fields, searching for movement, signs, tracks, anything. The corn stood tall and golden, swaying gently in the breeze, but something in her gut pulled her towards the western edge, where the rows dipped into a hollow near the creek. That's where she saw her. A girl crouched low, wrapped in an old blanket that barely hid the dirt and blood crusted on her legs. Her hair was matted, her face hollow and wide-eyed like a fawn cornered by wolves. Clara didn't call out. She knelt slowly, setting her rifle aside and raising both hands. The girl flinched at first but didn't run, and when their eyes locked, something ancient stirred in Clara's chest. Recognition, not from memory, but from blood. "Willa," Clara whispered, her voice cracking, and though the girl didn't nod, she didn't deny it either. She glanced past Clara towards the trees, trembling. "They chased us from the ridge," she said in a dry, cracked voice. "Mama said keep riding, said don't stop for anything." Clara swallowed hard. "Where's your mother?" The girl's lip trembled. "She fell, didn't move, I just kept going." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her. Someone had raised Willa, protected her, perhaps even loved her. But that woman was gone now, and in her place stood the one who'd once walked away. There was no time for grief, no time for guilt. Clara wrapped her arms around the girl and lifted her gently, her limbs far too light for a child that age. She carried her back to the cabin, whispering soft nothings the whole way, though they both knew the danger wasn't past. Once inside, she laid Willa on the cot by the fire and washed her scrapes with rainwater, biting her lip when the girl winced. Outside, a hawk circled, crying low and sharp. Clara knew it wasn't just birds that circled in warning. Whoever had sent that note had bought Willa enough time to reach her, but they wouldn't stop looking. And now that Clara had taken her in, she wasn't just facing shadows from the past. She was daring them to try again. This time she wasn't hiding from her name. She was earning it. By the third day, Willa had stopped jumping at every creak of the floorboards, though her eyes still scanned the windows whenever the wind shifted. Clara kept her rifle by the door and her ears tuned to every sound that didn't belong. The snap of a twig, the hush of hoofbeats buried in the wind. That morning she sent Willa to fetch eggs from the coop, while she hauled water from the well, trying to make things feel normal, though nothing was. As she leaned over the rope, bucket squealing against the pulley, a voice behind her made her spine go rigid. "You always were the quiet one, Clara." She turned slow, hands still on the rope, heart thudding so hard she could barely hear. The man stood 10 feet away, tall, gray at the temples, wearing a long trail coat, dusted with travel. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. She recognized him instantly. Reed McConnell, her brother's oldest friend, and the man who once helped her forge the false name on Willa's birth record. She hadn't seen him in over a decade. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly. He nodded once, almost respectfully. "And yet here I am, looking for something that belongs to someone who's willing to pay a great deal." "She's not property," Clara snapped, stepping away from the well, keeping her body between him and the cabin. "She's my daughter." His eyes narrowed, something like sympathy flickering behind the sharpness. "She wasn't supposed to make it this far. You think whoever sent her thought she'd survive? That horse was bait. You were the trap." Clara felt the ground lurch beneath that truth. A trap. Had someone counted on her to take the girl in? To paint a target on her own door? Reed sighed. "I won't hurt her. But if I don't bring her back, someone less patient will come next. And they don't ask questions first." Clara didn't flinch. "Then tell them you didn't find her." "You think I get to walk away empty-handed?" "You'll walk away breathing. That's more than they'll get." Reed studied her for a long time, the wind tugging gently at his coat. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You've changed." "I had to," she said. "Now go before you force me to prove it." He turned and walked off without another word, disappearing into the trees as quietly as he'd come. Clara stood there until the wind died down, then went back inside, heart pounding. She knelt beside Willa, brushing a leaf from her hair. "You're not bait," she whispered. "You're blood, and I'll burn the world before I let them take you." Clara knew the cabin wouldn't hold forever. Not against men with maps, rifles, and promises paid in coin. So that night, under the cover of a rising wind, she packed what little they could carry and saddled the roan mare that had once collapsed bleeding at her door. Willa clung to her waist without a word, her eyes wide, her breath shaky against Clara's back as they rode west through the hills, past the old creek bed, and into the canyons where only moonlight painted the trail. Clara didn't look back. She knew Reed might have warned them, but others would come, and next time, they wouldn't knock. By dawn, they reached a hollow where an old stone house leaned into the side of the hill, its door painted red and half the shingles missing, forgotten, buried in bramble, and perfect. It had once belonged to Clara's aunt, a woman whispered about for healing things people didn't like to name. Clara hadn't been there in over 20 years, but when she pushed open the warped door and stepped inside, it smelled like rosemary and earth, and something older than both. "We'll stay here for now," Clara told Willa, lighting the wood stove and bolting the windows shut. She laid blankets near the hearth and boiled water with dried chamomile she found in a sealed tin. Willa didn't speak much, but she watched everything, every motion, every glance toward the door. When night fell again, Clara taught her how to load a pistol, not because she wanted the child to fight, but because silence wasn't safety anymore. It was ignorance. "If you hear boots and I'm not beside you," she said quietly, "you hide. If someone opens that door, you aim for the legs and run." Willa nodded once, her hand trembling as it held the cold metal. Clara took it back gently, kissed her forehead, and tucked her close beneath her coat. That night, as the wind howled through the chimney and owls cried from the bare cottonwoods, Clara didn't sleep. She sat by the window with the rifle across her knees, watching shadows move across the hills, waiting for the shape of vengeance to take form. She thought of the life she might have lived if she hadn't given Willa away. The girl's first steps she never saw. The birthdays passed in silence. She thought of how shame had once carved her into a coward. But now she sat armed, awake, and unafraid, because a mother with nothing left to lose was the deadliest thing a man could chase through the dark. The next morning brought smoke on the horizon. Not thick, not high, but enough to put weight in Clara's chest as she watched it rise above the pines to the east. Someone was burning something, and out here, that meant messages. She saddled the mare in silence, and left Willa with a pocket pistol and a basket of canned peaches, instructing her not to open the door for anything but her voice. Then Clara rode out with her rifle slung low, circling wide through the ravine and climbing the ridge from behind so she could look down unseen. What she found made her blood run cold. A campfire reduced to ash, boot prints in the dirt leading both to and from a tree where a white scrap of cloth fluttered like a surrender flag. She slid down to inspect it and realized it was part of a nun's habit, torn, bloodied, half-burnt. Beneath it was a wooden cross snapped at the neck. Clara knew it belonged to Sister Mercy, the woman who had taken Willa as a baby and promised to keep her hidden. Now it was clear she'd kept that promise right to the bitter end. Clara stood slowly, her jaw set tight. Whoever had come through here had wanted to erase the trail, but they didn't know this land like she did. She found a broken branch, a misplaced stone, a trail of crushed mint where a horse had stepped wrong. Someone had taken their time, but not enough. They were still close. She followed the signs for nearly a mile until she saw the broken fence post that marked the start of Tanner's Gulch, a place locals avoided, cursed for rock slides and rattlesnakes. But Clara smiled grimly. No bounty hunter would expect a woman and a child to go that way, which meant it was now the only way. By the time she returned to the stone house, the smoke had faded, but Willa sat at the window, clutching the pistol exactly as she'd been taught. "It was her," Clara said, kneeling. "The woman who raised you. She died protecting you." Willa blinked, lips pressed thin, and then asked quietly, "Are we still running?" Clara shook her head. "We're not running. We're circling. We're setting the trap now." That night, Clara moved through the trees like a ghost, laying false trails, shifting signs, and dragging a soaked dress behind her to mimic hooves in the dirt. Let them come. Let them think they'd cornered prey. Because when they reached the house with the red door again, they wouldn't find a mother mourning. They'd find one ready to finish what shame had once left undone. He came just after dusk, quiet as dusk itself, riding a mule too smart to whinny and leading a second horse with an empty saddle. Clara saw him from the attic window. Just a flicker of motion past the sycamore tree before the figure dismounted and crouched near the chicken coop. She recognized him not by his coat or his build, but by the way he moved, like someone who had spent too long watching doors open that never should have. His name was Boone Tully, a tracker out of Fort Ridge who broke men for coin and never asked why. She'd seen him once, long ago, when her brother owed gambling money and Boone had come to collect with a smile and a pistol. Back then, he had a straight nose. Now it bent cruelly to the left, courtesy of someone who didn't go quietly. Clara slid from the attic and positioned herself behind the front door, rifle steady, breath held. She didn't plan to shoot. Not yet. She needed answers, not corpses. When Boone stepped onto the porch, both heels soft on the worn boards, she yanked the door open and shoved the barrel into his gut. "One word, and you won't finish the second," she hissed. He froze, then lifted his hands slowly. "Wasn't here to kill," he said, voice low. "Was told to look. Bring the girl in if I could. But they didn't say nothing about you." "Who sent you?" she asked. He smiled crookedly. "A name you've buried deeper than that child's birth papers. Same man who put the coin in your pocket back when you first disappeared." Clara's heart dropped, ice cold and certain. Only one man knew both her sins and her real name, Judge Harmon, the man who helped her hide the birth in exchange for silence about what he did to her sister. Boone licked his lips. "Thing is, I'm tired of doing work for men who'd hang me if I showed my face clean. Thought maybe you'd pay better." Clara lowered the rifle a hair. "You're switching sides?" "I'm switching odds," he said, "and right now they're yours." She didn't trust him, but she needed time. She needed intel, and Boone, coward or not, was the kind of man who could whisper into dark places. "You'll ride tonight," she told him. "Tell Harmon she's gone, vanished, River took her. Then you report back to me with everything he does next." Boone grinned. "Just like old times, eh?" Clara's eyes hardened. "Nothing like them." As he rode into the dark, Clara bolted the door and turned back toward the fire, where Willa was reading June's journal. "He's buying us time," she whispered. "Let's make it count." 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Boone hadn't returned, but Clara had learned not to depend on men who grinned too easily. She spent the hours training Willa, how to move without sound, how to load by feel, how to listen to wind patterns, and read the lean of animals before they fled. Willa absorbed it all with quiet focus, though Clara saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes always flicked toward the door before sleep. Then, on the 4th morning, Clara found an envelope nailed to the barn door. No hoofprints, no scent of fire, just a plain folded letter sealed with wax. She tore it open and read the single line. "She's not yours." Beneath it, scribbled in a different, sharper hand, was a name Clara hadn't heard in 12 years, Aurelia Kane. Her knees went weak. That was the name Clara had scrawled onto the church ledger the day she gave birth, trembling in a stranger's bed, swearing she would never be found again. No one else knew it, no one except the man who had held her wrists as she signed it, the one who promised a clean slate in exchange for silence. Judge Harmon. She sank onto the porch, the letter fluttering in her lap, and realized the game had shifted. This wasn't about Willa anymore. It was about Clara. The past she'd buried under false names and miles of silence was clawing its way back with teeth. Inside the cabin, Willa stirred at the sound of her boots, coming to the door with June's journal tucked under her arm. "You okay?" she asked, her voice still small but steadier than before. Clara stared at the girl who looked so much like the face she'd turned away from in that old mirror, Same eyes, same high cheekbones, same storm just beneath the skin. "I was wrong," Clara whispered. "They don't want you for who you are. They want you for who I was." Willa blinked. "But I'm not you." "No," Clara said, rising slowly. "You're braver." She gathered their things that afternoon, every scrap of food, every weapon, every piece of paper that told their story. They couldn't hide anymore. Not here, not anywhere. The only way forward now was through. That night, she burned the saddle, the journal copies, even the church record page she'd kept buried under floorboards. Only the truth would remain. And come morning, they would ride to a town where Judge Harmon wore a silver star he didn't earn, and where a mother planned to say her name out loud in front of the world, for the first time and the last. They rode into Gallows Crossing at high noon, dust curling up from the trail like smoke from an old fire that refused to die, and every eye in town followed them as they passed. Clara upright in the saddle, rifle strapped across her back, and Willa behind her, arms wrapped tight, face unreadable. The town hadn't changed much since Clara last saw it, but she had. No longer the frightened girl who'd limped away under the weight of her own silence, she now returned like a storm, walking on two legs. The gallows still stood in the square, a crooked wooden frame that once took more rumors than it did men. It leaned slightly now, like it had grown tired of watching justice be postponed. Clara tied the horse outside the old courthouse, ignoring the whispers that rippled through the crowd. Judge Harmon still presided here, still wore his polished boots and gold-buttoned coat like armor. Inside, the chamber smelled of varnish and old sins. He looked up from the bench and froze, his eyes narrowing as if peering through time. "Aurelia Kane," he said, voice laced with scorn and surprise. "That name died years ago." Clara stepped forward, voice steady. "So did your right to speak it." Murmurs rippled from the benches. "I come to put a name to what you did, and what you let others do under your seal." Harmon leaned back, scoffing. "You think bringing a child into my courtroom proves anything?" Willa stood beside her now, silent, steady. Clara raised a packet of documents, Boone's notes, letters from Sister Mercy, the saddle tag, and the town records she'd spent the last 3 nights assembling. "This proves everything." A younger clerk reached for it and began reading aloud. With each name, each connection to vanished children, each forged transfer, the room thickened with tension. Harmon's color drained. "You've no right," he began, but the sheriff stepped in from the back of the room, his hand resting on his holster. "You'll let her finish." Clara read the last line herself. "And I swear, by blood and bone, if harm comes to this child again, it will not be Gallows that find you, but the people whose daughters never came home." A long silence fell. Then, the sheriff stepped forward and took the judge's badge from his chest. The old man didn't resist, didn't speak, just sat, small and sunken, as the courtroom emptied around him. Outside, the wind had changed. Clara held Willa's hand and walked into the street, not triumphant, but free. For the first time in her life, her silence was broken, and in its place stood something stronger than fear. Truth, with a name. The letter arrived 1 week after the trial, tucked into the cracks of Clara's new porch, written in a firm hand with no signature, no return address, and only 3 words on the envelope. For Willa Kane. Clara found it while sweeping dust from the step of their modest cabin just outside Helena, far enough from Gallows Crossing to be safe, close enough to stay informed. She turned it over in her hand twice before calling Willa out from the kitchen, where she'd been stirring stew with the quiet rhythm of a child, relearning normal. The girl took it slowly, fingers brushing the edge as if it might vanish. She opened it without speaking, her eyes moving carefully down the page. Then, without a word, she handed it to Clara. The handwriting was familiar. Not Harmon's, not Boone's. It belonged to Sister Mercy. Somehow, written before she died, it had made its way across the chaos and landed exactly where it needed to. The letter was simple. If you're reading this, then you've made it. And if you've made it, then the truth is yours now. Not just about where you came from, but where you go next. You are more than a name, more than a birthmark or a saddle tag or a story someone tried to bury. You are Willa, and that is enough. Clara folded the page with trembling hands and pressed a kiss to Willa's hair. The girl leaned into her, no longer stiff, no longer watchful. They were safe now, or as safe as the West ever allowed. Clara spent her days cleaning land that hadn't been worked in years, planting herbs from memory and stitching clothes from scraps. Willa read voraciously, wrote in her own journal, and sometimes asked quiet questions that Clara always answered truthfully, even when the answers hurt. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the cottonwoods, Willa brought out a box she'd been hiding under her bed. Inside were the burnt remains of the old saddle buckle, the cross from Sister Mercy's neck, and a cloth-wrapped pistol. For the museum, she said with a smile. One will build someday. Clara nodded, pride swelling behind her ribs like a sunrise. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was memory. Preserved. It was future. Reclaimed. And though neither of them would ever forget what had been done, or what it cost, they had something no one could take. Each other, and a story that belonged to them alone. Not told in whispers or sealed behind lies, but in firelight, in ink, and in every tomorrow they now had the courage to meet. They built the sign together on the first full spring morning, when the wind carried the scent of wild sage and the creek behind the cabin ran clear again. Clara carved the letters with her father's old branding iron, heating it in the fire until it glowed red as memory, then pressed it gently, once into the edge of the cedar plank Willa had sanded herself. The letters hissed and smoked as they burned into the grain. Kane Homestead. Willa stood beside her, cheeks smudged with ash, her hair braided back, eyes shining with something steady and sure. It wasn't just a name, it was a vow, a marker that the past no longer chased them. It bowed to them. They hung the sign at the gate where the old fence line began, and for a long moment neither said a word. There was nothing left to run from now, nothing to hide. The town clerk in Helena had helped file the paperwork. Willa Kane, legal ward of Clara Kane, formerly known as Aurelia. No aliases, no second names, just truth, finally written in ink where no one could erase it. Boone had never returned, though word drifted through a passing freight guard that he'd taken a new name in Dakota Territory and was selling furs and whiskey to miners. Harmon would stand trial in the capital that fall, stripped of his robe, forced to answer for years of silence. And Clara? She started teaching. Not in a schoolhouse, there wasn't one nearby, but from the porch each Sunday, where ranchers' daughters came to learn reading, writing, and how to fire a rifle if they ever had to. Willa helped, drawing diagrams in the dirt, retelling stories from the journal she'd started in her own hand, a sequel to the one June had left behind. Sometimes, at dusk, they walked the edge of the creek where the mare had first collapsed, now buried beneath a blooming wild rose bush. Clara had planted it herself with water, bone meal, and a whispered apology. "We're not just surviving," Willa said one evening as they sat watching the sun melt behind the hills. "We're starting." Clara looked at her, at the strength in her frame, the steadiness in her voice, and nodded. "Yes," she said, "and we're doing it with our names written clear across the sky." and as night fell over the land that had once tried to forget them, two shadows stood side by side at the gate, mother and daughter, no longer running, no longer erasing, but standing tall where the world could see them, branded by love and lit by the fire of a future no longer borrowed, but earned.